This talk is taken from Mark 4, verses 35 through 41, and I've titled it, Was Jesus Nuts? So I'm in my early 20s. I was living in Allentown and working as a draftsman. Every weekend I would travel to my parents' home in Berwick, but there was one weekend, due to a work deadline, I needed to stay. Well, we were able to wrap up the project late Saturday afternoon, and I decided, with a free Sunday, to go to church the next morning in Allentown. Now, at this point, it had been a while since I attended church. Well, the message that morning had a huge impact on my life. The pastor was teaching on the importance of developing a growing friendship with Jesus, and at the heart of this friendship was trusting him with everything. It was an invitation to be his student, to learn from him and to follow where he would lead. For close to 40 years now, I've been pursuing Jesus, reading about him, reflecting on his life, studying his teachings, and seeking to follow him. Over that time, one of the important things that Jesus has been teaching me, and what I believe that he wants each of us to understand, is this: the world is a perfectly safe place for us to be. Now, I don't know how that statement strikes you, but as I consider it and reflect on my life, the world I live in, the circumstances I encounter, and the environment here at the Capitol, I often wonder, is Jesus nuts? But you see, as you look at his life and his teachings, this was his consistent message to his earliest followers. At one point, when Jesus was teaching them not to worry about their physical needs, he says that they should consider the birds of the air and how God cares for them, or to reflect on the creative genius and beauty displayed in the flowers of the field. If God cares for such as these, do you not believe that God has made provision for you? In essence, what Jesus was saying is that if we will but place ourselves in his hands and allow him to shepherd our lives, no harm will come to us. Now, harm isn't exactly the same thing as hurt. We're still vulnerable, but no harm can come to us because we are safe with him. We are safe in his care. Today, we're going to be looking at an account when Jesus was with his disciples in a boat, and his disciples were having some trouble with the sea. To frame this account a little bit, Jesus was teaching by the sea, and crowds had gathered around him, and they grew so large that he got into a boat on the water's edge, sat down, and continued to teach the crowds until evening. Then in verse 35 of Mark 4, Jesus says, let's go over to the other side. I don't know if you know this, but often the biggest storms of life come at Jesus's leading. We find ourselves in a comfortable position, and he says, let's go to the other side. Maybe it's illness of ourselves or our loved ones. Maybe we come under attack. Maybe he calls us to a new area of service or to the political arena. Maybe it's losing an election or the unsettling nature of how sessions started this year. Jesus says to us, let's go to the other side. That's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge. Well, picking up in verse 36, so they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. So I guess this Jesus was sleeping as the waves were rolling over him. If the waves were breaking over the boat, and he was in the boat, they were breaking over him, and he was asleep. Now, a question to ask ourselves is, what kind of vision of life is Jesus presenting to us in this account? Well, the disciples get concerned. You clearly see where their hearts are at in the midst of the storm. In verse 38, the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned? Forget about the boat. We're about to drown. Don't you care? Wake up." Jesus' response is so interesting. After rebuking the wind and the waves, he says to them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" In verse 40. And here, Jesus is working with his disciples to shepherd them, to help them to understand what's happening in the situation and what's happening in themselves. What Jesus understood was that they had faith in Jesus. They had faith in him, but they didn't have Jesus's type of faith. Do you see what I mean? They had faith in Jesus. They waited for him to do something, and when they couldn't wait any longer, they got a hold of him and said, "Now you do something. You're supposed to fix our circumstances." Well, what do you think the disciples are saying in response to Jesus' words? We see in verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." You see, one of the things that Jesus knew that he was trying to help his disciples to understand and for us to grasp is that Jesus knew that he was in a God-permeated world. And he could sleep in the storm, and he could wake, and he could minister. You see, Jesus knew that God filled the heavens and the earth. There's no place where God is not there. He could be perfectly safe, and so he slept. And he says to us, we are perfectly safe. You know, Jesus continues to impress upon me how important it is for me to know that I'm perfectly safe in his care as I face the storms of my life. A recent storm for me relates to our family finances. Since our kids have been little, my wife has watched other people's children in our home to help with our monthly budget. We've been extremely blessed through this whole experience. It's not only helped us with our family finances, but it has also allowed us to establish long-term friendships with these families and children throughout the years. But the downside is there's a certain level of instability in our family budget. Recently, 2 of these children will no longer need Ishbel to watch them, and as a result, our monthly income has been reduced in a significant way. And what I notice happening is that those old fears and doubts and insecurities could come so easily rushing back into my life. As we reflect upon our account, we see that there were a fair few fishermen in the boat. And one of the things that we realize is that this idol of control, of reliance on their own competencies and their own personal safety was at the forefront. I can just imagine of them trying every trick in the trade. They've been through this many times to try to get through the storm. And when their safety was threatened, their faith seemed to disappear. It seemed to evaporate right before their eyes. And this overwhelming situation intermingled with this growing fear, and it caused them to doubt the goodness of God and Jesus' care for them. You hear them cry out, "Don't you care?" As we close, when we face these all too familiar scenarios, we must be able to reorient ourselves back to ultimate reality, and that is of God and his kingdom. Psalm 16, 8 and 9 says, "I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. my flesh also dwells secure. What we need in these situations is a vision of the Lord that will steady us in the storms of life. As we close our time, I would like to leave you with a practice that I've found helpful in my own life. Psalm 23 speaks to David's personal relationship with God, and within the context of that kind of relationship, we can be safe in the storms. We begin to see a vision of a life without lack. And so each morning, I would just encourage you to read Psalm 23 and rest in the truth that God is so much greater than anything we see around us. Ask him to shepherd and to direct you into this type of life. And finally, be willing to yield to the ways he will seek to make that a reality. I'd just like to close our time just by reading Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. May God bless you. Thank you.